Fluorescent lights were too bright. That's the first thing I remember. The way they burned into my eyes, even through my eyelids. And the sound of a monitor beeping somewhere to my left, steady and indifferent. A nurse's voice cut through the haze. Evelyn. Hey, stay with me. My mouth tasted like copper. My left wrist throbbed underneath something tight. I didn't know yet how long I'd been unconscious. I didn't know yet that my brother-in-law had already posted bail. 4 days earlier, I was standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen in Scottsdale, holding a document I hadn't asked to read, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I grew up in Tempe, Arizona, the oldest of 2 kids. My dad drove a delivery truck. My mom worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic. We weren't poor exactly, but money was always a conversation at our house. A careful one, spoken in lowercase. I learned early that things didn't come to you. You went and got them. By the time I was 19, I was taking night classes at Maricopa Community College and working days at a title insurance company. Scanning documents, flagging discrepancies, answering phones. It wasn't glamorous. The fluorescent lights there were also too bright, and the coffee was always burnt, and my supervisor called me on, even though she was only 6 years older than me. But I was good at the work. I had a brain for numbers and a stomach for detail, and by 22, I'd passed my licensing exam and moved into an entry-level analyst position at a small real estate investment firm called Hargrove Group. I met my husband there. Daniel was a project coordinator. Easy laugh, wide shoulders, the kind of man who made a room feel warmer without saying much. We dated for 2 years, got married in a backyard ceremony in Mesa when I was 26. It wasn't until after the wedding that I really understood his family. His mother, who I'll call my mother-in-law, ran the household like a corporation. Her husband, my father-in-law, had passed when Daniel was in high school, leaving behind a modest life insurance payout and a house in a quiet Scottsdale subdivision. My mother-in-law had stretched that money carefully, raised 2 sons, and built her identity entirely around the idea that family was a unit, a team, a collective. She said that word a lot. Collective. Daniel's younger brother, I'll call him my brother-in-law, was 31. Charming in the way that men who've never been told no tend to be charming. He had an MBA he'd finished at 30 and had since spent 2 years pitching what he called a disruptive real estate tech platform to anyone who'd sit still long enough. He had a slide deck, he had a logo. He had approximately $40,000 in credit card debt and a lease on a Range Rover he could not afford. I didn't know about the debt yet, that came later. What I knew was that I'd spent 4 years at Hargrove quietly building something on the side. Not a startup, nothing flashy. Just a LLC I'd formed with a colleague named Patrice. A woman I trusted, who had the same background I did and the same appetite for detail. We bought 2 distressed single-family rentals in the East Valley, renovated them ourselves on weekends, and rented them out. We did it again. And again. By the time I was 29, our little LLC had 6 properties, clean books, and a quiet monthly cash flow that I hadn't mentioned to my mother-in-law because I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't a secret so much as it was mine. Then my grandfather died. He was 84, sharp until almost the end. A man who'd spent 40 years as a civil engineer and invested every spare dollar into index funds. He had no surviving spouse. He had 2 grandchildren, me and my younger brother, who was 24 and in grad school in Oregon. The will divided his estate evenly, half to each of us. My share came to a little over $400,000. My grandfather's attorney called me on a Thursday morning in October. I sat in my car in the parking garage at Hargrove and read the letter twice. Then I drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and told Daniel. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should tell my mom." I should have paid attention to that. The automatic reflex to bring her in. But I loved my husband, and I thought I understood his family, and so I said okay. We drove to Scottsdale that Sunday for dinner. My mother-in-law made her pot roast, the one she served when she wanted people to feel soft. My brother-in-law was already there when we arrived, which felt staged in retrospect, though I couldn't have proven it at the time. Halfway through dinner, Daniel told her. My mother-in-law set down her fork very carefully. She looked at me. "That's wonderful, Evelyn. Your grandfather would be proud," she smiled. She asked me to pass the bread. The subject changed. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, my mother-in-law called me on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew Daniel would be in a site meeting. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. She said she'd been thinking about the inheritance and she wanted to share an opportunity. My brother-in-law's platform, she explained, was at a pivotal moment. He had a meeting with a seed-stage investor in Phoenix in 6 weeks. The investor wanted to see real capital already committed. Skin in the game, she said, using air quotes I could hear through the phone. $200,000 would get him to the table. It would be structured as a loan, she said. With interest, document. Professional. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, of course. Take time, family doesn't rush family. I talked to Daniel that night. He was on his brother's side before I finished the sentence. Not aggressively, not cruelly, just reflexively, the way you flinch before you've even felt the impact. He said it was a real opportunity. He said his brother had changed. He said it would mean a lot to the family if I could help. I asked him what he thought I should do with my grandfather's money. He said, obviously it's your call. But his eyes said something different. I spent a week doing what I do when I need to think clearly. I made a spreadsheet. I pulled my brother-in-law's business plan, which he sent me as a 43-slide deck with a lot of gradients and very few numbers. There was no revenue model. There was no competitive analysis. There was a section called Vision, with a stock photo of a sunrise. I cross-referenced similar platforms that had launched in the past 3 years. 2 had folded. 1 had pivoted entirely into something else. I called my brother-in-law and asked him to walk me through his unit economics. He laughed. He said I was overthinking it. He said that's what investors do. They overthink, they miss the moment. He said his instincts had always been good. He said Elon Musk didn't use spreadsheets. I told him I'd have an answer by the end of the week. He stopped laughing. I called my grandfather's attorney, a woman named Miss Chukwu, and asked her if there was any way to structure the inheritance to make it harder to touch without a court process. She walked me through my options. I asked questions for an hour. When I hung up, I opened a new account at a bank my in-laws had never heard of and moved the full inheritance there. Then I called my mother-in-law and told her no. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who was surprised. It was the silence of someone recalculating. She said she was disappointed. She said she thought I understood what family meant. She said my grandfather's money didn't come from nowhere. It came from a life of discipline, and discipline meant investing in people, not sitting on cash. She said she would pray for me. I thanked her and ended the call. Daniel came home that evening already knowing. She'd called him first. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me like I was someone he was trying to recognize. He said, "You couldn't even discuss it with me first." I told him I'd discussed it with him for an entire week. He said that wasn't the same thing. The next month was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Scottsdale in November is still warm. Our house was not. Daniel was present but absent, in the same rooms, not in the same conversations. His mother called him every day, and I knew it, and neither of us mentioned it. My brother-in-law texted me twice. The first text said, "Evelyn, just think about it. Don't let fear make this decision." The second text said, "You know what? Never mind. I found another investor. Hope your spreadsheet keeps you warm." I didn't respond to either. In December, Daniel's mother announced a family Christmas gathering. His aunt was flying in from Denver. His cousin was driving up from Tucson. It was presented as a reunion, warm and ordinary. I almost didn't go. I wish I hadn't. The house was decorated elaborately. Pine garland on the banister, candles on every surface, a tree that touched the ceiling. My mother-in-law was in a cream-colored sweater and pearls. She hugged me at the door like nothing had happened. She offered me wine. She asked about work. Dinner was pleasant for 40 minutes. Then my brother-in-law tapped his glass. He said he had an announcement. He said he was grateful for family, grateful for belief, grateful for the people who understood vision when they saw it. He said his platform had secured a new strategic partner. He smiled at me across the table and said the partner had been more than generous and that it proved what he'd always believed, that the right people always show up when you stop chasing the wrong ones. The table applauded. My mother-in-law dabbed her eyes. Daniel squeezed his brother's shoulder. I sat very still. My brother-in-law looked directly at me and said, "Some people will always choose the safe play." That's okay. Not everyone's built for something bigger. Something changed in my chest. Not anger exactly. More like the sound a lock makes when it finally, definitively clicks shut. I set my napkin on the table. I said, clearly and without raising my voice, "I hope it works out for you." He said, "It will. It already is. Maybe you'll want in later, when the valuation's higher." I said, "No, I won't." His smile didn't change, but his eyes did. He said, "Still running those little rental properties, making your little spreadsheets?" He said it to get a reaction, to make me small in front of the room. His aunt laughed, not unkindly, the way people laugh when they're uncomfortable and don't know what else to do. I looked at Daniel. His jaw was tight. He said nothing. I said, 6 properties, 14% annualized return last year, no outside investors, no debt. I looked at my brother-in-law. That's what a spreadsheet does. The table went quiet. My mother-in-law said, "Let's not make this a competition." My brother-in-law said, 400,000, sitting in a savings account, because she's scared. I said, "It's not in a savings account." He stood up, not aggressively, just suddenly, the way people do when the conversation has left them behind and they want to catch up physically. He said, "You know what your problem is? You've always thought you were better than this family, better than Daniel, better than all of us." I said, "I think this is done for tonight." He stepped toward me. Daniel finally stood up. The aunt said something sharp. The cousin pushed back from the table, and then my brother-in-law's hand came down flat and hard on the table directly in front of me. Not a strike, but close enough to one that wine sloshed from my glass and the table shook, and I stood up fast and stepped back and caught the back of my chair wrong and went down. I didn't hit my head. I hit my wrist. Cut the tile edge wrong. Compound fracture of the radius, the ER doctor would tell me later. I also hit my shoulder on the chair leg and cracked something small near the collarbone that hurt every time I breathed for 2 months. I lay on my mother-in-law's kitchen floor in a cream-colored house decorated for Christmas, looking up at the popcorn ceiling, listening to everyone talk at once. My mother-in-law said, "Oh my God, she fell." My brother-in-law said, "She backed into it. I didn't touch her." Daniel crouched down beside me. His eyes were frightened and guilty and something else I didn't have a word for yet. He said, "Can you move?" Someone called 911. I remember the pine smell of the garland. I remember thinking very clearly, this is the last time I will be in this house. I was right. The ER intake nurse was brisk and kind. The doctor set my wrist and told me to follow up in a week. A social worker came by. Young woman, clipboard, tired eyes, name tag that said Renee. She asked how I'd been injured. I told her exactly what happened. She wrote it down. She gave me a number to call. Daniel sat in the waiting room the whole time. When I came out, he stood up immediately and reached for me, and I took a small step back without meaning to. He noticed. We both noticed. He drove me home. We didn't talk much. When we got inside, he said, "He didn't mean to hurt you. He wasn't trying to." He stopped. He started again. "He gets heated. You know how he gets." I said, "I know exactly how he gets. Evelyn, I need to sleep." I went to bed with my wrist in a splint and my shoulder wrapped and my grandfather's attorney's number saved to my phone. 3 days later, I called Ms. Chukwu. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I want you to call someone else too." She gave me the name of a family law attorney in Scottsdale. She said, "Before you do anything else." The family law attorney was named Mr. Ibarra. Calm, direct, the kind of man who chose his words like he was billing by the syllable. I told him everything. He listened to it all. Then he opened a folder he already had waiting on his desk and flitted across to me. He said my grandfather's attorney had contacted him 3 days before I called. I stared at the folder. He said, my grandfather, it turned out, had been more observant than I knew. In the 2 years before he died, he'd had several long phone calls with Ms. Chukwu about what he called his concerns. That I was married into a family that had a habit of treating capable women like sources of funds. He'd watched from a distance. He'd taken notes. He had written the second document, not part of the will, not legally binding on its own, but a letter to Ms. Chukwu with instructions. If anyone in my husband's family made a financial claim against my inheritance or caused me documented harm, she was to release it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten in my grandfather's precise engineer's print. He wrote that I was the one who had always shown up. At 11, reorganizing his filing system without being asked. At 17, asking him to explain his 401k allocation. At 22, telling him about the LLC with the kind of calm clarity that made him sit back in his chair and think, she's gonna be fine. He wrote, she doesn't need protection from the outside. She needs the world to get out of her way. He'd also, Miss Chuglu had documented this, flagged to her something she then passed to Mr. Ibarra in the months before his death. My brother-in-law had called my grandfather twice, posing as a financial advisor, attempting to get information about the estate structure. My grandfather had written the dates, the caller ID, the exact wording of both conversations. My brother-in-law had been trying to get to my grandfather's money before he was even gone. I sat in Mr. Ibarra's office with my wrist in its splint, and I read my grandfather's letter twice, and I did not cry until the drive home. And then I pulled over in a Walgreens parking lot and cried until I couldn't anymore. And then I went home. Daniel was there. He was waiting. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and I put the folder between us, and I said, I need you to read this. He read it, all of it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I didn't know he called your grandfather. I said, I know. He said, Evelyn? I said, I need to know whose side you're on. He looked at the folder. He looked at his hands. He said, that's not fair. I said, it's the only fair question. He didn't answer for a long time. Long enough that I had my answer. I moved into a furnished apartment in Tempe the following weekend. I took my laptop, my files, my clothes, and the print of an old Arizona highway my grandfather had given me when I turned 21. I left the furniture because we'd bought it together and I didn't want to have a conversation about the furniture. Mr. Ibarra filed a police report the same week using the ER documentation, the social worker's notes, and 3 witness statements, the aunt, the cousin, and a neighbor who'd heard the commotion through the window. My brother-in-law was charged with misdemeanor assault. He hired a defense attorney and blamed my unstable behavior at the dinner table for provoking the incident. The case went before a judge 6 months later. The judge was not impressed by the provocation argument. My brother-in-law was convicted and sentenced to 40 hours of community service and 18 months of probation and ordered to pay my medical bills. ER visit, orthopedic follow-up, physical therapy, 2 months of it. Mr. Ibarra also filed a civil complaint for attempted financial fraud, specifically the phone calls to my grandfather. That case moved slower. It settled quietly, 14 months after I filed, for an amount I'm not required to disclose, but which covered my attorney's fees with enough left over to put a down payment on a 7th property. I won't lie to you. The divorce was not clean. Daniel was not a villain. That's the complicated part, the part I've had to sit with. He was a man who loved his mother more than he'd ever examined. And when the moment came, he didn't choose me. That's not evil. It's just not enough. We finalized the divorce 11 months after I moved to Tempe. He kept the house because I didn't want it. We divided our joint savings evenly. He's living in Scottsdale. We don't talk. My mother-in-law sent me a card 6 weeks after the divorce. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. It said, I hope you find peace. I put it in the folder with everything else. My brother-in-law's platform, as far as I can tell from public records, never made it past the seed stage. The mysterious strategic partner he announced at Christmas was a small family office that pulled out 8 months later. His LinkedIn still lists him as founder and CEO. The company's last activity was 18 months ago. I kept the LLC. Patrice and I bought 2 more properties last year in Mesa and in Gilbert, and we're closing on a 3rd in Chandler next month. We started a small mentorship group for women in real estate. Nothing formal, just a monthly dinner where we talk numbers and answer questions and tell the truth about what it actually takes. At the last dinner, a young woman who'd just closed on her first duplex asked me how I'd known to protect myself before things went wrong. She was 25, nervous, smart, the kind of woman my grandfather would have liked immediately. I told her, you build defense before you need it. You know your numbers better than anyone else in the room. You don't sign anything that takes your name off the door. She wrote it down. I watched her write it down, and I thought about my grandfather at his desk with his engineer's print, writing 4 pages that he hoped I'd never need to read, just in case I did. Protecting what you've built is not selfishness. It's the only honest thing you owe yourself. I keep thinking about my grandfather at his desk, not the version of him I knew at the end. Quieter, slower. But the version that sat down sometime in the last 2 years of his life and wrote 4 pages by hand because he'd been paying attention. He didn't call me. He didn't warn me. He just watched and wrote it down and trusted that the truth would hold its shape until it was needed. That's the part that stays with me. Not the court settlement, not the divorce paperwork, not the moment Mr. Ibarra slid that folder across his desk. It's the image of a man in his 80s doing something quietly right, without applause, without anyone knowing. I think about what it takes to be that kind of person. My grandfather didn't build his savings by accident or luck. He built them through decades of decisions that nobody celebrated at the time. Skipping things he could have justified buying, tracking numbers other people found tedious, asking questions in rooms where it would have been easier to stay quiet. He had a clarity about what was real and what was performance, and he chose real every single time, even when performance would have been more comfortable. That clarity is something I had to learn the hard way myself. I was good at the technical side, the spreadsheets, the due diligence, the licensing exams, but I was slow to trust what the numbers were actually telling me about people. When my brother-in-law sent me a 43-slide deck with a stock photo of a sunrise and no revenue model, I knew what it meant. I ran the analysis anyway, because part of me wanted to be wrong, wanted to find a reason to be generous that would also be smart. There wasn't one. And sitting with that, not bending the numbers to fit what would have made the room easier, that took something I didn't have a word for at the time. I'd call it integrity now. The willingness to see what's actually there, even when it costs you something. The cost, in my case, was a marriage. I don't say that lightly. Daniel wasn't cruel. He was a man who had never been asked to choose between his mother and his own judgment. And when the moment came, he didn't have the muscle for it. That's not evil, but it meant I was alone in a way I hadn't expected to be. And building back from that required a different kind of strength than anything the spreadsheets had asked of me. It required getting up and going to work on days when the furnished apartment felt very quiet, and the drive to Tempe felt very long, and doing it again the next day, and the next. Not because I was certain it would pay off, but because stopping wasn't something I was willing to do. That persistence, the unsexy, unwitnessed kind, is what actually changed my life, not the inheritance, not the legal outcome. Those were consequences. The cause was every early morning I showed up when I didn't have to, every dollar I tracked when no one was watching, every no I said clearly and without apology when the pressure to say yes was real. My grandfather understood that. He wrote it in blue ink on 4 pages he hoped I'd never need. I needed them. And because he was the kind of man he was, honest, meticulous, unwilling to look away, they were there. That's the thing nobody tells you about doing the right thing consistently over a long time. It compounds. Just like interest. Just like rent on a property you renovated yourself on a Saturday when you could have been doing something easier. The returns aren't always visible until suddenly they are, and then they're undeniable. Build the fence before you need it. Know your numbers better than anyone else in the room. Don't sign anything that takes your name off the door. And pay attention. Always pay attention. Someone who loves you might be doing the same.